prayer life, going to Mass, as Catholics we're called to actively practice our faith. But a new poll by EWTN and RealClearPolitics shows that's not always a top priority for many Catholics. And faith doesn't necessarily guide their voting decisions either. Welcome back to EWTN News In Depth. Carl Cannon, the Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief of RealClearPolitics, and Dr. Matthew Bunson, the Executive Editor of EWTN News and Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief, join me now to go more in depth on the results of our new poll and what the numbers show us about Catholic thought and Catholics voting right now in America. Gentlemen, welcome and thank you for joining us. Carl, before we dig into the specifics, what did this poll tell you about the so-called Catholic vote? It seems Catholic voters are just as divided as the rest of the country. Does the Catholic vote even still exist?
Well, Catholics vote. It's not a monolithic vote, but Catholics vote. It's going to be anywhere between 1/5 and 1/4 of the entire electorate. And to put it as bluntly as I can, Democrats need a slight edge among Catholic voters. They got that in 2020. Joe Biden won. You know, these things aren't exact, but we think best we can tell he got about 53% of the Catholic vote against Donald Trump in 2020. And right now in our poll, the numbers are reversed. It was 53-47 before. Now it's 53% of Catholics disapprove of Joe Biden's job as president, and only 47 approve. And so that's just a switch. And the other thing that I found significant is on the generic vote. You ask people, not by their congressperson by name, but are you going to vote for the Democrat for Congress or Republican? And that includes Senate, House. Catholic voters are split almost evenly. Slight edge to Republicans. I think it's 44-43 with 13% undecided. But again, Democrats need a little edge there. And I don't think it's much of an exaggeration to say that those 13% undecided Catholic voters will probably determine the outcome of the 2022 midterms. And with it, who controls Congress, Republicans or Democrats?
So one more time, you're going to be catering to Catholics in voting outreach. Matthew, what does the Catholic Church say about voting? Is it a duty for Catholics or encouraged in some way for us?
Well, one of the best places to start in answering that question is to go all the way back to the middle of the 2nd century and a fairly obscure document called the Letter to Diognetus. And in it, he's defending Christianity against the Roman Empire. And he makes the note that it is the obligation of Christians to be good citizens of the empire. We can see throughout the whole of the remaining 2,000 years of church history, basically, that Catholics are called to be good and faithful citizens. We see that mentioned very specifically in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, that Catholics are to participate in political life, the betterment of society, to work for the common good, and part of that is what's described in many ways as a moral obligation to vote. The U.S. bishops reiterated that as well, as did the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith with its document Participation in Political Life by Catholics. So there is that obligation to participate, but then there's also the call that the Church always makes to discernment. Are you forming your conscience properly before you vote? And that's where it gets very complicated. And that's where I think a poll like this is important, as we're trying to understand where Catholics stand and how well formed they are as they make up their minds in preparation to vote.
And whether they bring their full selves with them to the ballot box. Carl, the RealClear poll indicates that 78% of voters do not consider their political party when they vote for a congressional leader. Is that a common trend? Party affiliation is important for primaries, but what does it really mean on the general election day in November?
Well, it depends. You know, we have this Roman Catholics, big group, but when you drill down, the more the more pious people are. This is true somewhat of Protestants too. The more often they go to Mass, the more often they say the Rosary, the more often they pray, the more likely they are to vote Republican. This has been a trend that's emerged in the last 2 generations. It wasn't true when John F. Kennedy ran for president. He's the first Roman Catholic president. 80% of Catholics voted for Kennedy, whatever their politics. And the big issue that year in the campaign was whether John F. Kennedy would, vote his conscience, vote the country, be a Democrat or be a Catholic first. And Kennedy assured people that Catholics were just like everybody else. That's one of the things that informs their decision making. We've made great progress in a sense. You don't hear a lot, or if any, anti-Catholic bias against President Biden. Joe Biden's the second Catholic president. But what you do see is this dichotomy. The more people are committed to the Catholic Church, the more active they are in the church, and the more active they are, and the more I don't want to use the word conservative because that's not right, but the more loyal they are to the teachings of the church, the more that they incorporate those teachings into their everyday lives, the more likely they are in recent elections to vote Republican.
And that an understanding of history and tradition is a part of their lives. Matthew, just 20% of Catholics answered that they accept all of the church's teachings, and that's reflected in how they live their life. And 35% accept most church teaching, and 27% do not accept some of the key teachings of the church. How does that impact voting on issues important to the church?
Yeah, well, Carl was just making a very important point, and you're hitting on it bluntly here, and that is what we find. There are two real determiners of how a Catholic is likely to vote. The one that you just mentioned, how much of the teachings of the church, how many of the teachings of the church do they embrace and act on in their lives and make part of their lives? The other is how often they attend Mass. What we're finding is that there is a wide gulf between those who accept the teachings of the church and those who don't, and how they tend to vote. We can see that very clearly on issues like abortion, on transgender ideology, and elsewhere. So those, again, are key for us in any polling, and we're going to look very closely at that. One thing that's worth noting, however, and this goes back to the very first question that we wanted to address in this poll, is where Joe Biden stands with Catholics. And one thing that's notable in this is that Joe Biden is underwater. He has a higher unfavorable rating with all groups of Catholics, whether they accept the teachings of the church or whether they don't, whether they go to Mass a lot or they don't. Joe Biden is facing real problems with every cohort among Catholics today.
It's important. And another hot issue that he's dealing with is immigration. Carl, a plurality of Americans expressed dissatisfaction with the immigration process in February. And in this poll, they're divided over support of expanding legal immigration to the U.S., with 49% saying that they're more likely to support immigration expansion. Does that track with the general sentiment in the country on immigration?
Yes, it does. On immigration and some other key issues, Catholic voters are either conform to the majority or trendsetters, are early sort of. You see where the Catholic vote's going. You see where some of these issues are going. Latino voters in this country, Catholic Latinos, are more supportive of Joe Biden than Anglo Catholics. But the support is slipping even there, and you saw this in an election, two elections in Texas that won a primary earlier this year, in which the last pro-life Democrat in Congress withstood a challenge, very narrowly, but withstood a challenge by a pro-choice Democrat in the primary, and a special election that went to a Republican who's born in Mexico.
Mayra Flores.
There you go. And she's a very devout person, and some of these cultural issues, we've learned in other polls that what most voters want, Catholic and non-Catholic, is for the administration to really address inflation and to deal with the structural problems of this economy, which have gotten really bad in the last 2 years.
And we will keep looking at these results over the next coming weeks. And I know EWTN News Nightly will be covering that as well. Thank you so much, gentlemen.
Good to be with you.